about African museums and artifacts, their preservation? Do we really value them? And perhaps why are some of them still in European countries? What is happening? I do want to mention that, recently Belgium returned a golden tooth, the only relic of the past prime minister, rather, of the DR Congo, Patrice Lumumba. And Belgians, as it was said by many of those who have been reporting this story, they say typical of colonialists, kept it as a trophy, and definitely it took years for it to be released for burial and closure. And this is not just the only story. We've seen different stories coming up about the Belgian artifacts that were recently repatriated, and this is just one of the stories that we're looking at today. And I'm happy again to have all of you with us today. Allow me to just introduce my guests tonight. We have quite an interesting array of guests today. I do know we have Charles Leshaw, and I know Charles will be joining us in just a moment. Charles is the founder of Ma Museum and Center for Indigenous Cultures, registered by the Ministry of Culture and Sports and Heritage in the Republic of Kenya. He's also an award winner of he's an award winner of the Olega Salie, if I have that name correct, Best Tourism Village, and he has done a lot on conservation of artifacts. Of course, we also have Juma Ondeng, who works with the National Museums of Kenya as a keeper of antiquities, sites, and monuments. And of course, we have also just one other guest who will be joining us in a moment. I know there's also Saita Bao, who is a filmmaker, by the way, and he has produced a film that touched on issues that have to do with African museums and just the preservation of artifacts. And he is really passionate about the preservation of this artifacts and museums and everything that relates to issues around African museums. And we're just happy to have all of you. I know Maria Sarungi is also with us tonight. I'm happy to see you, Maria. And I'm glad we're having this conversation, Maria. I don't know if you have a comment for our listeners and, of course, just our speakers today regarding this very much important topic. We'll definitely come back to you, Maria. I can see there's a bit of a challenge when it comes to connecting. I know my producer is sorting that out. Saita Bao, I see you there with us today. And one of the things I know, there's been a huge conversation, especially after the repatriation of Patrice Lumumba's tooth. I mean, this is something that is a development that has raised eyebrows about just the preservation and the value that's given to African museums and artifacts. But Saita Bao, I'd like you to just give us, your experience and some of the things you've witnessed as far as just the preservation of African museums is concerned. Saita Bao.
Hello, everyone. I hope you can hear me well. Thank you, Leah, for the introduction. I just want to introduce myself. My name is Saita Bao Kayare. I am a filmmaker. I recently did a documentary called If Objects Could Speak, where we take an African, actually a Kenyan object from a museum cellar, and we wanted to physically take back the object, but it was not possible due to bureaucracy. So we had to create a 3D installation to find out what this object is and what it was used, because the museum, the Linden Museum in Stuttgart, Germany, had very little information about it. So our work was to find out, go to upcountry Kenya to find out what this object, because this object was entered the museum in 1903, and we were lucky enough to find the information what the object was and what it was used for. So we've been doing around the work of restitution and repatriation also through the film to demand a lot of African artifacts that are in Western museums. And we find some of the artifacts that are there are communities that are demanding the return of these artifacts. So this is one of the works that one of the projects that I'm doing. I've recently finished, and I'm working on other projects that touch on the said subject.
All right. If I can just ask, Said, about the artifact you're talking about, what was it exactly?
So it was an object from the Kikuyu community. It had a spiritual and cultural importance to the Kikuyu people back in the early 18th and 19th century. So I wouldn't want to disclose what the object. This is part of, where you get to experience the journey that we took up until finding the answers. But it is an object. I can say it's an object of spiritual and cultural importance to the Kikuyu people, and the knowledge system of this object has slowly faded away. So that was part of the work that we did with the documentary.
Fantastic. I know you're talking about preservation of artifacts, and that's what your documentary was also highlighting. What do you feel about this in terms of, what we've seen across the African continent? Some countries still demand repatriation of artifacts that belong to their countries. What do you feel about the preservation of these artifacts?
When it comes to this debate about restitution and repatriation, we happen to find a lot museums saying, especially Western museums saying, you're not able to preserve these objects. And I feel that is from a prejudice perspective, because at the end of the day, some of these objects are day-to-day artifacts that were used by communities, and some of these artifacts are demanded by these communities. For example, recently the Patrice Lumumba's tooth being returned, and they have significance. And one of the things the family needs to bury, because it's very in the African context, it's very important to bury those ones, to let them rest in peace. When it comes to preservation and conservation, you find a lot of Western museums have fumigated and have put very harmful chemicals to these objects. So, for instance, in the pursuit of preserving and these objects, however, some of these objects were day-to-day artifacts that were used, and somehow they're able to be preserved in their own way. The communities know how to preserve, because you find some of these artifacts were looted, or they were taken using brutality during the colonial period. So when it comes to even our museums here back in Kenya and in Africa in general, we still get to see a lot of artifacts that have been well preserved, well kept, and well documented. So it's a matter of question of who does these artifacts belong to, and who has the right to preserve and conserve them. And honestly speaking, I believe it's the people, it's the community. Going beyond the people and the community, we're trying to strengthen our institutions by the local museums, and you get to find even there are a lot of small museums in villages. And
all right. I mean, Saitebao, I like some of the things you've mentioned. Some of them were taken forcibly, with brutality. But just also for the sake of, some of our audience that has joined us tonight, I know when we use the terms artifacts and museums, it might not entirely be, something that is familiar for everyone. Would you mind maybe just helping us, understand when we talk about artifacts and museums in Africa, what are we referring to?
So I'll begin with the context and the concept of a museum institution. So the museum institution, even though we have museums here in Africa, you find museum institutions are a colonial matrix. It is a colonial institution where a lot of, during colonial period, those people who the colonial governments would expedite a lot of artifacts. The artifacts meaning these are objects that belong to the African people. Some of these artifacts were used on day-to-day activities, and some of them had spiritual importance, some of them had cultural importance, and some of them had national importance. Mostly, when the colonial governments took some of these artifacts, they went to showcase them in the quote unquote, in the name of research or scientific research per se, and the term of ethnographic. This is where the term of ethnographic comes into place, where it is a study of non-Western people just to understand the different cultures. So when it comes to the museum in itself, it's an institution which we also borrowed it, in Africa. So it's always about displaying different cultures and other cultures, and artifacts are day-to-day objects that have importance to the people and have meaning and significance to the people. When it comes to the museum,
thank you so much for that,
which we also borrowed
Said
it,
about. Just to remind also our audience, today we are talking about African artifacts and museums. The question we are asking is, do we value them enough? And some of the things I know Saita Bao has mentioned, even as we begin our conversation tonight, is some of these artifacts have been forcibly taken from African countries. And I like what you're saying, Saita Bao, that they have some spiritual meaning, meaning that most of these communities to whom these artifacts belong to, they hold a sort of identity for them, I guess. If I can just mention a little bit more artifacts in this case, and I know Saita Bao, you've mentioned, like in the case of Benin, we've seen masks and we've seen some statues there, and it's been a literal battle for some of those artifacts to be repatriated back to Benin. I know some of our speakers are still trying to get on the platform today, and I do see Maria, you are with us today. I'm happy to see you, Maria. Quite an important conversation here, and just listening to Saita Bao tells you of how much Africa is a rich continent rather, in terms of resources, that these artifacts have had to be stolen, and they're probably gaining some revenue for someone in some of the countries that are holding them illegally.
Yes, thank you so much. I did have a bit of a connectivity issue, but I'm glad I'm back on. Saita Bao, I was just able to catch a little bit toward the end, but I completely would, first of all, like to really just stand in awe of what you're doing. But second, just what you said about the artifact issue. I think the question that comes into my mind is who attaches value to it? And when we say, do we value them enough? Actually, it's a good question. It may be spiritual, but then you will find somebody who is called an artifact collector, or will even call himself or herself an art collector, will take a painting that we would deem as even dare to call it primitive, or just sort of say this is like a child's play, or this person is half mad. But that piece of work of art, or it could be even not art, it could be functional in that given society, is given a lot of value by this art collector in the West. And suddenly what you have is the work of one person who may not even know the value of the work that he's churning out, being, bought up, stolen from museums, becoming very valuable in the Western world. And at the same time, you find that people who should be benefiting from this don't. And I don't necessarily always think that it's only a problem with the Western approach, or what we can call the neo-colonial or colonial approach. But I also think we need to be able to see things from others' point of view. Meaning, do we understand that there could be value in some of the things that we take for granted, or for some mundane things that we do, and how do we try to monetize it? Sounds terrible, but I would really love to also have the conversation moving that way as well.
Thank you, Maria. I'm really, really hoping that two of our speakers are able to get on. Saita Bao, bear with us a little bit, but I love that you're here with us, Saita Bao. Tell us a little bit about your film and what you were able to capture that relates to issues around the preservation and repatriation of artifacts. Just a little bit about your film.
Thank you, Maria, for that input as well. Yes, of course, it's very important even not to just blame the Western world about the value. So when we're working on our film, just to give a little bit more context, like I did earlier, we visited various German museums, and we were curious, we were in awe about all these African artifacts. Personally, I did not know they existed, and so in our journey, we found one object in a museum cellar hidden. It's not even in the exhibition. So we were able to sort of, we had conversations, and in our naivety, we thought it would be easy to take that one object back to Kenya and find out what it is. But we got to find out it's a whole bureaucracy process. It's not as easy as we thought it would have been. So we were able to create a 3D scan through augmented reality, where sort of gave the object like life to it. It's not the actual object, but it's a replica of the object, and people were able to observe it. So we took down the object back to Kenya. We traveled in big cities, and we went to the rural areas to find out what the object is. And during that process, we found out the biggest question we had would be like, would people value this object or artifact? And the fact that it's not even physically there, it's just a 3D replica. So those are some of the questions we asked ourselves. Will people value it? Will they see the importance of the artifact? And to our surprise, we found people very interested. You know, they had so many questions about this artifact, this single artifact. And they expected us to have answers, but we also did not have answers, because we were on a journey to find out what this artifact was. So along in our process, we got to find out, you know, the importance, because it feels these artifacts are far away from the people. They did not know they existed, and they became more curious. And there's a distinction between being curious about it and valuing it. And at the end of the day, we were able to sort of find out what this artifact was, especially talking to the older generation, because these are part of the artifacts. We don't just look at the artifacts on their face value as objects, but also as knowledge systems. You know, the artifacts in itself have they have a certain knowledge systems about them, and we were able to sort of decipher and decode that. So that was part of the documentary we worked on. And and I can see one of my producers is here. Momo Liku is here listening in. But yeah, that's basically the short synopsis.
Thank you. That sounds wonderful, by the way. Thank you, Saita Bao. I'm happy to see the rest of our speakers. Two of our speakers have been able to join. I'm really happy to see you, Juma Ondeng. Juma Ondeng is one of those key officials who work at the National Museums of Kenya as a keeper of antiquity sites and monuments. Of course, we also have Charles Leshaw. As I mentioned earlier on, he's the founder of Ma Museum and Center for Indigenous Cultures. Charles, so happy to see you as well as Ondeng. I'm also happy to see you here. I'll just go to you, Ondeng. I know you've been working at the National Museums of Kenya for quite a while. Just looking at some of the reports in my little research, just trying to understand the Kenyan situation, we see that Kenya's National Museums runs the Invisible Inventories program, which documents Kenya's artifacts, which are said to be held in other jurisdictions. Maybe you can even tell us a little bit more about that. It said that, you know, some of the artifacts are printed in 3D, yet the National Geographic reports that one of the printed artifacts was, well, laughed off by Nyanza locals. But, you know, what's the situation like in Kenya, Ondeng, as regards the preservation and just, you know, the protection of national museums? Ondeng, I think in case you're trying to speak, you can just tap on the icon to the bottom left of your screen. That will enable you to be able to speak in a way that we can actually hear you. I don't know if you can hear me, Ondeng. Just tap on the icon to the bottom left of your screen that looks like a little microphone, and you'll be able to speak. All right. As we give Ondeng time to be able to speak, I think we'll move on to you, Charles Leshore. Okay. Then you're able to speak. Fantastic. Okay.
Now, are you able to hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Good evening.
Ondeng, it seems like we're having a bit of a network problem from your end.
Evening, our
Right.
listeners.
Hello? Ondeng, I think there's a bit of a network issue on your end. I'll just have my producer pick that up with you.
It's fast to go as I sort out.
Okay. Ondeng, let's just get back to you. I'll allow my producer to get in touch and possibly try and help you out with the network issue. Let me just move on quickly to you, Charles Leshore. As the founder of Ma Museum, what are some of your experiences when it comes to, just the preservation of some of the artifacts that are there at the Ma Museum and just generally the preservation of Kenyan artifacts? Charles, if you can hear me.
Thank you, Ngure, for this and joining the audience to talk about repatriation and restitution and preservation of artifacts, especially from local communities. Can be a very daunting exercise. One, because they may not understand the feature and how to preserve these particular artifacts. That are now very few. Most of them are disappearing in the communities. And again, the experience that I have is the fact that while in Kenya we had the devolution, yes, devolution has happened, but the skills, the technical part was actually not devolved. So community museums, private museums still have challenges to safeguard and preserve facts for the future generation. And that's actually the experience. Number two is also the specialists, the technical people who are supposed to be able to handle these artifacts will not be available at the community level. And sometimes we may have good well-wishers who want to support communities come up with museums, help them with coming with the museums, but the museums might not live long because of the technical skills when the project is handed over. And we have an experience as Ma Museum for one of the museums that was started in parts of Magadi, Kekenyoke, among the Maasai. We also have a museum in Narok, which was done by the government for immortalization of one of the minister, Ole Ntimama. And yes, there is still challenges of running them and even storage for these particular artifacts that are found in Africa and Kenya, indeed.
All right. Charles, as I listen to you, when you talk about challenges even of preservation and storage, would you say perhaps, African countries are, do you feel like perhaps we value enough our artifacts and museums?
I think in Africa, it is a new topic. That's the same as repatriation or restitution of some of our objects that were lost or stolen and have to be returned to their proper owners. And that's what restitution and repatriation means. African governments have a long way. We may have museums, like in Kenya, we have the National Museums of Kenya. That really does a lot for the country. But when it comes to, of course, the small museums, maybe community museums, private museums, yes, then that is where there is a lot of help that is needed. And again, when you look at African museums in the context, for example, of Kenya, in terms of devolution, then it's not a priority sort of issue. It's not given priority, like roads, building classrooms, building hospitals. So there's a lot of funds going to other sectors, but in African setups, museums in Africa, and especially the private and community, are seen as museums for the white people. So that also makes even the entrance and the people to come for museums and even schools to really uptake in terms of getting to museums, in terms of education, and even bringing the young people. So the MAM Museum, for example, has programs on education and research because we believe museums now are not just it's not just about the exchange items or artifacts, but it's more about generating those discussions of importance to the communities. And this is where now one of the discussions and conversations that are very key is all about repatriation and restitution. And again, yes, looking at in terms of restitution and repatriation, we look at Kenyan objects that are already outside in Europe museums. When you look at the work done by National Museums of Kenya and I think supported by Gothe Institute, that was done by National Museums of Kenya through a young activist, Chachu. It really brings front the Kenyan objects that were not really loud, like Benin or artifacts from Cameroon and other parts of the country. And really this was a very good project because it brought front to ask ourselves the key questions on restitution. What are some of these artifacts that are stored in especially in Germany, British and France, because these were the powerhouses which refer to many decades of colonial powerhouses, and they are also the same that avoided talks on agreements for transfer or restitution or transfer of ownership of these artifacts. So past 120 years ago, most of the African kingdoms were destroyed, and this is where we had quite a number of artifacts in terms of bronze, in terms of course we had other artifacts. There was the bronze, there were other sculptures. In the case of Kenya and some of the artifacts that we are following up with our partners, and John Denge has been very, very helpful. For example, for Kenya, we had a drum used by Pokomo in Kenya for legal and spiritual ceremonies, stolen at gunpoint in the year 1900. And it was taken away, meaning the souls, the heartbeat of a society has been taken away. Koitalel Arap Somoy, a Nandi leader who was invited for a meeting, was beheaded, and his head is missing up to now. There was also a spear that was used to kill Yuj. Yuju was a DC, he was a colonial officer in Narok, in a small village called Loita on the border of Kenya and Tanzania. And this spear happened to have taken, I think, to Germany. And there are, of course, 20 museums that most of these artifacts were distributed. Some of them were donated, by missionaries or explorers who came to Africa, for exploration purposes. And even for the Maasai Museum, we are following up on Oledume. I think if you are in Nairobi, you should be able to know Oledume. There is Oledume Road, there are Oledume properties, especially along Hurlingham and Kilimani. You'll find that name. Oledume was Oledume. His right name is Leaduma, who was a Samburu king who was deported by the British colonials for a mistake that he was not found guilty, and he was taken to, and he was one of our heroes who was fighting for the land, when the 1911 and 1904 agreements stated that Maasai should be moved to southern and northern reserves. So he has been fighting for that. He was deported to death He has never been brought back. And when they deported him, there was an inventory of about 50 plus items that he used for Sokari, because he was a Lebon, but the British call him and Sokari. And here was when now they developed a law on Sokari, and Olodome Bari was deported. He was last seen, some of his footprints were last seen in Kilifi, and then later on there is a street in West Africa that we are trying to follow to know whether he was buried there. So what we are asking now in 2021 being the year that there have been some commitments and a turnaround for that underpins, of course, the commitment by looters and the colonizers that they return back these items to Kenya. The issue of preparation, they say we are not prepared, we may not have facilities. I think every country is prepared. And even if we are not prepared, I think we are prepared to get on conversations of how to safeguard these items and how they should go back to communities, because some of them are souls and the heartbeat of their communities.
Thank you, Charles. Thank you, Charles. Fantastic. You know, Ondeng, I know you're here with us. I'm hoping that you're able to hear me and able to speak now. Ondeng, are you there?
Yes, I think now I'm able to speak. Are you getting me?
Yes, I can. I can hear you perfectly. Ondeng, I know we've been talking about a little bit. I know Saita Bao mentioned just how ruthless, some of the Western countries and even European countries were seen to be in the past in looting some of these artifacts. And when we talk about artifacts, we're talking about maybe statues or masks that are made of wood that they were carved. These are instruments that are considered either to have religious attachment, or they just give communities in Africa identity. It's very interesting to note, and this is just something maybe you can also correct me. The British Museum in London, going by reports, is said to hold at least about 73,000 objects from sub-Saharan Africa. And France is said to hold about 90,000 artifacts, most of which were stolen during its colonial rule over much of the region. What do you make of, just the looting of these artifacts, the holding of these artifacts to this moment by these countries, Ondeng?
That's a very good question. But I won't really hold the countries keeping these objects utterly responsible. We as Africans and our government in particular are also to blame. In previous conversation with scholars such as Professor George Abungu, it became apparent that during the struggle for independence, when negotiations were happening in Lancaster for the case of Kenya, for example, one of the items, the agenda that was being discussed was also repatriation, bringing back objects, archives, any material that left in an illegal way during the time of colonialism. Now, 60 years later, here we are still talking about bringing back these objects. And when you look at it, the beginning of the whole restitution debate currently ongoing is being traced back to President Macron visiting Ouagadougou sometimes in 2017. Now, my question is, are we really serious about restitution? Because when you look at the state of preparedness in African countries, and this includes Kenya, we are not seeing policies, changes in policies towards demanding repatriation of these objects back, because you need a legal framework through which you engage with your with the counterparts in Europe and in America and elsewhere. We need databases that will show us what really left the continent, because up to 2017, for example, after President Macron's visit to Africa, the organization of what we call it, the AFRICOM, African Council of Museums, then the president, Dr. Rudolf Sitole, had requested member countries to send to AFRICOM list of objects they felt should be restituted. But that never happened, because the truth of the matter is no one knows exactly how many of African objects are out there. Now, so we don't only blame the Westerners or any other person who took part in that loot, but we also have to blame ourselves because we are not asking ourselves the right questions. Now, we need to find out what exactly is out there. That takes money. We need those databases. And establishing databases, if they are funded by foreign interest, I can tell you, you don't even know whether what they're giving you is exactly what they have. So if our governments take more responsibility about this and they invest their money in, one, creating databases, secondly, creating legal framework through which these objects can come back, third, making this a bilateral issue so that it's not only a talk show, because even as we speak now, I can tell you how many African governments have gone to those museums and demanded for things to come back. It is still just in the newspaper. We are talking here about it, but no one is writing letters. I can tell Kenya has not written any letter demanding anything to come back. The same thing with Uganda and Tanzania and so many countries from Africa. So we are talking about it. It's in the newspaper, it's in the mass media, but no action is being taken. But I feel bad that objects are still out there. Thank you.
Thank you. And then if you're saying then the issue here is not even so much the Western or European countries that are holding these artifacts, and from what I hear, it's also just the goodwill of these African countries to maybe initiate just the repatriation. But it seems like, going by so many cases and case studies, so many of them we could talk about, and then really repatriation requests and processes have been there for a long time. But what you see is, all these claims that some of the European countries won't step back and just release these artifacts. And then why do you think this is the case?
Now, museums worldwide are governed by laws. I'll give you an example of the British Museum. They have an Act of Parliament that was changed, I think the last time was 1964. Now, that Act of Parliament makes it very difficult, extremely difficult for the British Museum to release objects. And a number of museums operate using different legal instruments that give them power to hold those objects. However, the acquisition method used. Now, what we need to see happening is this. We need our own government to get serious about this. Now, what has been happening in Africa is that communities, civil society members, individual people have been going out there to demand for their objects. Those institutions out in the West are not happy to deal with individuals. Always when you go there and you say, I'm Jumondeng, I would like to get this Pokomo drum back. They don't know me. But if it's the Kenyan government asking the British government for the Pokomo drum, the story will be totally different. Because we have trade partnership, we have other bilateral engagement with the British. If it's a Kenyan government engagement in the process, the British Museum will listen. And that's how countries like Ethiopia, for example, have been successful to some extent in bringing a number of their objects back. Because it is a government to government negotiation, government going to British Museum and sending their representative to British Museum or Albert and Victoria Museum and saying, we know you have this and we want it back. We can tell you evidence of when it left our country and how it ended up here. So already they have documentary proof that that object indeed left their country in a particular year. Then what then happens? The governments there can have a number of ways. So if the British Museum, the law does not allow them to give back that object, they create some other ways of giving it back, and they'll call it a permanent loan. For Ethiopia, that language, the language used in giving them that object does not matter to them. What is important, they have their object back. So whether in the inventories of the British Museum, it shows that that object is still owned by the British Museum, but on a long-term permanent loan to Ethiopia, it doesn't matter. So if we can get back the Pokomo drum through the government of Kenya, for example, and that Pokomo drum goes back to the Pokomo community, if from the British Museum side they list it as object on permanent long-term loan, it doesn't matter to the Pokomo community. What will be important is that the object is back. So we need this agenda to be not only a talk show thing, it should be something that even in the political party manifestos, we should start seeing it. Each party saying, okay, if we take power, this is how we are going to handle things that we lost during colonial times. That is not happening as we talk.
Wow, that's really interesting. Saitabao, I know you mentioned earlier on that you did manage to visit some of the museums, and I know you mentioned one of the artifacts that you and your team tried to, get repatriated. But what do you feel about the comments coming from Ondeng and the fact that he says, it's not so much the European countries? I know he's mentioning there's the issue of just the systems that inform the repatriation process. What do you feel about this, Saitabao?
Yes, I do agree with Ondeng. Of course, we also have to involve our governments in having these conversations, and it's very important to have government in the forefront in this in championing restitution. I also just wanted to mention, apart from the question being, do we value them enough? Another thing which is very important we should be doing is also decolonizing our mindsets, because you often find we've also been sort of told to see African artifacts as objects of witchcraft. And that's why sometimes even you find people in the government, they really don't want to associate with African artifacts because of the notion that they are objects of witchcraft, which is not true. Not all objects are associated with witchcraft. So it's also about decolonizing the mindset as well. So if we're able to also decolonize the people themselves and also government officials, because there's this whole during the colonial era where we are told whatever practices that we do are witchcraft, that hence the introduction of all these other religions. So it's also very important to deconstruct and decolonize the mindset.
All right. Charles, working with the Ma Museum, of which you are a founder, have you experienced any of these things that we're talking about? Maybe there are some artifacts that were looted and perhaps you're trying to help communities, get repatriated or restored back to the museums. Charles, if you can hear me. All right, I'll just go back to you, and then I hope
Charles needs to unmute his mic. I think.
Hear me now?
Yes,
Hello?
we can hear you. Yes, we can hear you now.
Yes. Yeah, the Ma Museum has attempted to work, of course, with the National Museums of Kenya and Goethe Institute for some of the artifacts that belongs to the indigenous communities of Kenya. And one of the artifacts is the spear that was used to kill Yuge at DC 1943 in Loita, Narok, when the British officer called Yuge took one of the favorite bull of Ole Sendeu, and having just come from the bush drinking medicine and herbs, he was so irritated that he was able to, of course, kill Yuge, because this was his favorite bull called Ole Melelo, and he even offered to give the DC 5 to 10 other bulls. This was during the World War II, when the British would really mobilize cows and put meat in tins and take them to their soldiers. That really is not a very good experience, because one, Ole Sendeu was found, of course, guilty. He could not even understand the court procedures at that time, and even the person who was translating that was not translating in the very well for him to understand the questions. And he was, of course, hanged, and I think he's buried around Ngong area. We also have the Masai Lebon Oledume, and who comes from Samburu, And this was one of the fighters fighting for the Laikipia, the issue of Laikipia land. And apparently one of the settlers was in his horse, and he was killed by a lion. Now, and later on, somebody else came from, I think, from Nandi, to say that he had the Samburu singing this particular song, praising Ledome, and that was not true at all. And later on, he was deported, not to be seen until today. And also some of his artifacts, about 56 of his artifacts. And I think Saitaba talked about some of these aspects associated with Sokari and witchcraft. And these were his tools of work, in the community. And some of the tools will foresee what comes in the future, the good side, the bad sides, and all that. That's another one. We had about 6 Kenyans and Tanzanians visiting Oxford Pitts River University in UK, and they were able to realize that there were 5 artifacts very dear to them, and the discussions are there. But as my other colleague said, the British, of course, government has been very reluctant to get on this topic after, of course, Macron kicked off commitments to repatriate these artifacts, and this is a new dawn and also a new collaboration to return African objects stolen forcibly, and also a general declaration for return of African artifacts which were looted and people were banned. The kingdoms like Benin, these were kingdoms that were banned and destroyed today. So when we already see some of these things being returned, like Nigeria, there are already 2 bronzes being returned. There are some bronzes also in southwestern Nigeria, and also France has been committed to return 26 bronzes stolen in 1892, and that's the same thing to many over 100,000 stolen bronzes in 20 museums in Germany. So we look forward for the commitments. There are already letters of intent signed by, of course, for the transfer of ownership of some of these discussions, and there are also discussions on technical aspects of the physical returns and loaning to some of these artifacts that were also donated. So this is the time to say yes. As they say, bring back Ngimoso, we are also saying bring back King Lodome, bring back the spear. We need them because our people are also associating, climate change, drought, diseases to some of these objects that are outside there. So it is time to say yes. As Mam Museum, let us return these particular artifacts to the right owners so that they can also continue with their lives.
Thank you, Charles.
Yeah, Leah, can I just quickly add a question? And I think that question will go to Charles, but also to the other speakers. And it's about a little bit around the decolonization that Saitabao was talking about. My question is this. When we talk about value and whether we value it enough, and I really loved what Ondeng also said about the governments. We have, for example, views within governments whereby they would say like the Maasai are primitive people. For me, if you're a government official and you call your own people primitive, it sort of shows that you have very little value for what they do and what they wear and their culture and all that. So my question is, how much of the visitors go to museums? Let's say to the Mav Museum, but I think maybe Ondeng can help me also for other museums. How much local visitors, meaning like do Kenyans go to Kenyan museums and do Tanzanians go to Tanzanian museums to learn about their own history, about their own, cultural and even, past and all that thing? Do they even bother, or is it mainly museums are just for tourists? There's an attitude, I believe, that, we don't go to the museum because it's only for tourists. How do you see that? Because I still think that there is a disregard for our own ancient history and art and artifacts. Charles, I'll start with you. Thank
you. Thank you for the good question, and I think I will agree with you in terms of whether we value enough our ancient artifacts, history, and even heritage. And I think basically from me, when it comes to visitation, and because you had asked about whether they visit, there is very, very low visitation to indigenous museums. I'll give you an example of a museum that we have in Olergezaile after we won the Best Tourism Village through the United Nations World Tourism Organization. And I think I still remember we had only 2 people, visiting that museum. Today, it is still there since January. We have not had visits to the museum, despite also thinking maybe it is about marketing, road signs. It's not. But what I believe myself as my museum, what I believe as a founder is, do we value museums to trigger conversations about the issues that affect us as Africans? And if we don't look at it from that perspective, so that we value our history, we look at our heritage, we care, we safeguard, and we have those conversations around that, then it will be a little bit difficult. When you look at schools, we have been visiting schools and also joining other communities mobilizing for international days. Like in Kenya, we have Madaraka Day, we have Mashujaa Day. Mashujaa Day was a little bit confused. People don't understand the national day. And we really had to have a day at a shrine in Kona Baridi in Ngong Hills, where our Oloibon Olonana was buried. And I want really to thank the CS for forests, Mr. Tobiko. Because he was able to give us 16 acres for immortalization of Oloibon. Basically, so yes, it's not really a lot, but we need to do a lot of education. We need to sensitize our communities and also work closely with the county government to understand their roles in facilitating the museums and communities to understand these treasures.
Hello?
Yes. Am I? Are you with me?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes, you are.
I just wanted.
So in conclusion, yes, we need to raise more awareness. The county governments and national governments have to come down to the ground and help those museums, but we need to create a lot of awareness. And we are trying to do that through vernacular radio stations for them to understand really the importance of safeguarding our ancient histories, the importance of visiting museums, and also for the government really to support small community and private museums, because many times you don't even get a sense, from even your own government when they look at it as not really of priority compared to roads, classrooms, health facilities. So yes, I agree. We have a lot to do, and we need to work on frameworks, as one of the speakers said, to be able to generate this discussion and to take this discussion further.
Thank you.
I just wanted to respond to what Maria also asked about the perception and how people, the primitive aspect as well. So especially in my line of work as a filmmaker, it's also a responsibility that I hold about how to package the narrative, especially to audiences, and creating awareness. For example, based on the feedback, we've been able to have screenings maybe around different places, and from people just watching the film, they started appreciating museums. And based on the feedback, a few people approached us and told us after watching the film, we started going to the museum to appreciate the different artifacts or the different knowledge is there. Because at the end of the day, it's very important also to mention, to also sort of, deconstruct and decolonize the concept about the African culture is primitive, but in actual sense, there's a lot of knowledge, within these artifacts. Like, for example, you might find astrology, you might find even medicinal, you might find different even scientific concepts that were used back then. So it's about the narrative, how you present it to the audiences, and that is part of the work that we're doing in terms of creating awareness and packaging it in order for people to get curious and to get engaged as well. Engagement is very important, and also for us to be able to look at these artifacts and try and interpret, what our forefathers or ancestors, how they used them, because you find there's a lot of even philosophical ideas behind some of these artifacts. They're not just for beauty, but they had significant meaning. And yes, that's part of also as a work of a filmmaker that we're trying to push and do in terms of getting people interested in visiting museum and paying attention to the artifacts.
Thank you, Saita Bao. I know one thing I'd like us to really just bring out, even as we talk about the challenges and all that has been happening around just the preservation and even the challenge of repatriation. But what really would you say, Ondeng, is the significance of African museums and artifacts?
Museums are places where we keep our collective memory. They are not just spaces for the past, they are also spaces of the present and also spaces for the future. I'll give you an example, because when people talk about decolonizing African museums, and when you look at the case study of the National Museums of Kenya, for example, it's a museum. That's the word everyone knows. And that's the only one story about the National Museum that the Kenyan public knows. Hardly do they know that National Museums of Kenya is a fully fledged research institution that is focused on researching problems that we face in this country. So we have research scientists working with farmers, for example, to help them come up with new ways of doing things. We have people who are working, documenting indigenous knowledge, medicinal knowledge, knowledge about indigenous fruits, and trying to domesticate this in a way that new products can be created out of them. And those products will be more beneficial to us, because some of them, for example, people know that nowadays we value herbal medicine, for example. Those knowledge are domiciled in communities. And as a heritage institution that is focused on both the tangible and the intangible cultural heritage, we are bridging that gap by documenting that knowledge and then packaging it in a way that going into the future, we are going to have products that will be made out of the natural products resident in this country. So what museums like NMK is doing is not just to get stuck in the past, but we are using that past as a mirror through which we are seeing ourselves. Where did we come from? And when you look at the question of where did we come from, you know all the evolutionary stories and the paleontological knowledge, archaeological knowledge in this country is immense. We call Kenya as the cradle of humankind. And we are looking at ourselves through time and space, but we are not stuck in that past. We are looking at the challenges of the present. We are looking at climate change, for example, and how it's going to affect this country. It's going to affect our communities. And therefore, we are also carrying out research on how to come up with climate-smart responses to the changes that that are affecting us. So objects are kept in museums, but they are used as inspiration and looking at them in a different way, but also using them as inspiration for new inventions. So going forward, those objects are preserved, not just for the sake of preservation, but we are also using them to have new ideas about the future. So museums in Africa, I think when talking recently, we were in conversation with a Nigerian colleague, and when I explained what National Museums of Kenya is doing, for example, the conservation of forests, because that's something that no one will say, oh, how is a museum engaged with forests? Because forests are part of intangible heritage. There are communities who have a lot of belief system around forest. And we preserve rock art sites. We are in open spaces where we engage with farmers. We work with school groups. So we do curriculum linkages so that our museums are not just spaces where people come to enjoy, but there's also learning that takes place. And that's why we work closely with the national curriculum developers to find ways through which we can link our exhibitions to the national school curriculum. That way, museum then serves in the education agenda of a country, and through that we play more other roles in society other than just the visitation. And I will also want to jump in on the question of who visits museums. Now, in the Kenyan public now, I think mostly, and this is not just a problem that is unique to Kenya. I think in Europe, it's always about the old men, the middle class, or elderly people and retired. They are the most patrons in museum. So their museum face challenges. How do you attract the younger people? Here, we have three categories of visitors. Now, number one group that visits are always school groups. That's the majority. And they are bursting because schools take this as part of their curriculum. A visit to museum will be mentioned in the syllabus in some of the classes, or they just do it as an outing. So if we have 1 million visitors in a good year in National Museums of Kenya, almost 70% will be school groups who come in large numbers. And so they do the ritual visit where they just come in, see things, then they go. But we also have foreign tourists who come and as part of their international travels. But we also have a significant number of Kenyans of all ages who make visit to museums a priority. And so we are seeing the trends changing over time. Thank you.
Thank you, Ondeng. Saitabao, I know you, even just being able to interact with some of these museums and the challenges that they have been facing in just getting repatriation of some of these artifacts. But what would you say is the greatest impediment in getting some of these valuable artifacts that, you know, as just as Ondeng has said, there's a lot of value, there's a lot of importance of preserving this heritage that is inspired by these artifacts. But what would you say the continent is facing as the greatest impediment towards getting them repatriated back to the respective countries?
In terms of the continent, I believe, or I think, it's that engagement, having people engaged in the conversation, because it's very important to have different voices being able to vocalize about some of these objects. So it's always about engagement and awareness. I feel that's the biggest challenge. And in terms of, in general, I'd say it's transparency, just like what Juma said. Also, our institutions, like the government institutions, need to ask other European institutions for transparency, to give databases and information about some of these objects that are out there. Because at the end of the day, you'll find some of the artifacts that are well documented, the knowledge is still there. But there's also a danger whereby that those that are not properly well documented, or those that are wrongly documented, that knowledge system might slowly fade away, because probably you'll find the elderly, let's say people who are 80, from 80 and above, are the custodians of this knowledge. And there's a rush, there's a need to know what is there that is not properly documented, in order to also save that information and have that knowledge system well preserved moving forward, because there's that danger of losing all these incredible knowledge systems that will fade away slowly. So my opinion, from both spectrums, from both I'm not just blaming the Western world, but also from our perspective, is that engagement and awareness, and sort of also vocalizing and getting people involved. So it means that means it's a lot of education, a lot of mobilization, and showing the importance of why these artifacts are important, because we also have to preserve them for the next generations to come, not just for us, but the future generations. And like Juma said, and then just mentioned as well, we can use some of this knowledge for the future. We can be able sort of to forge the path and the way for the future by sort of incorporating what we know now and what was then, in order to be able to create a better future.
Thank you, Saitabao. Charles, if you can just tell me in terms of, I know you're running the Ma Museum and you've been working with communities towards, preserving and just creating a good environment. And I know you've talked about storage issues and different challenges, but what do you think maybe governments, not just even the Kenyan government, but even the African governments, what can they do even just to fast track the process of getting some of these artifacts from European countries, and even just initiating a conversation that can bring some sort of, conclusion to the repatriation process?
Yes, this is a very good question on what African countries should do. And number one is to support, countries to reclaim African history. Pan-African Heritage Museum in Ghana is coming very strongly, seeking to reclaim African history. We also have the Prussian Cultural Heritage Foundation that has confirmed the return of, for example, Ngunoso artifacts of the Northwest Cameroon. The other very key thing is coming up for policy to react to destruction of African heritage, not just geographically in Europe, Pakistan, Ukraine, but also in Africa. It is time that we need to react to some of the objects that are abroad. For example, you remember when there was the introduction of the railway in Kenya, and we had lions that really ate on most of these people building the railway. And now these lions artifacts are stored in New York. So it is time really to come up with policies to react really to destruction of African heritage, and not just in Europe, because this has been happening in Europe, Pakistan, Ukraine. It's now time for Africa really to have these policies. The other one is, of course, see more MOUs, so that more MOUs are signed for the transfer of the rights to African people. And all this, we should anchor also our voice on repatriation as per the third international conference on African cultures, ICAC, that was held back in November 2021, where we are saying African government should speak, Africans themselves should speak at all levels, confronting restitutions and repatriation of African artifacts, human remains, objects and archives from African perspective. And we really want that African countries can take an opportunity of what the President Emmanuel Macron has done as a president of France, so that other countries can follow suit and follow that particular country. So again, back to the local communities, local governments. It's 10 years of devolution. It is time really to assess and see what role have they had in terms of facilitating small and community museums in Africa and Kenya. Thank you.
Thank you, Charles. Ondeng, I have this very, interesting question, and I think it's just an idea I've been, pondering over. Looking at the perpetual detention of Africa's heritage through, just the holding of these artifacts, would you perhaps say this is maybe some sort of continued colonization?
Yeah, that's a good question. I will look at it that way too, because when you look at the power dynamics in this conversation, it's not power dynamics of the equal. If you go to UN, for example,
I don't know what's happened to you. Can you hear me?
I think someone tried calling me. Yeah, I'm hearing you.
Sorry about that. You can pick up.
Power dynamics. Therefore, what we need, and we should be advocating this from the prism, from the idea that human rights were violated in Africa, and for countries in the West who perpetually lecture Africa about human rights and justice, it's high time Africans also turned the tide and demanded justice to be done. Because keeping these objects is part of that domination. So they are dominant, and therefore they set a different rules through which they play. So if they decide it is time to keep things, they keep. If they say they want a bit of tokenism, they decide which one do we release. But they're still holding a lot of things. Now, the surprising thing is that these objects they are keeping, they are not even using most of them for exhibition purposes. So in any museum, you'll find if they have 10,000 African objects, be sure to find out that possibly only perhaps 100 of them will have gone to any exhibition of some sort. Majority are kept in their archives just for whatever reason. I know there are countries that they give monetary value to those objects, and therefore those museums can be able to access funds based on the kind of collection they have. And so they have other reasons to keep those objects for their economic value. But continuing keeping of those objects actually is a perpetuation of the colonial injustice, and is also part of that domination that they sought by coming to colonize Africa.
May I just add to it, that Leah, in that sense, and I completely want to agree with Ondeng on that. A very good example is Tanzania. Actually, the skull of one of the we'll call them the resistance leader, but he actually was a paramount chief from Mkwawa, and he also led the first resistance against the Germans. When he was killed, his head, to be exact, his skull, was taken to Germany. And it's only recently, of course, with a lot of embarrassment and the restitution that has happened, that now I think they've already returned it, or they're in the process of returning the skull. But for many years, they didn't want to return it. On top of that, and I actually even loved what Saita Bao talked about, the German museums. Germany has got a lot of artifacts from Tanganyika, which is Tanzania mainland. And it includes the very famous Maji-Maji War, which was a resistance war done by various tribes that united against the colonial forces. And actually, and I've done extensive research, and I was interested to do a serious documentary, and also a film about that. And one of the things that I did was I actually talked to the Germans, and they said outright that they don't want to open up the Pandora's box, because they might be forced to start negotiating on compensation, which they were forced to do with the Herero people. But they have all the important artifacts, documents. They even have documents about, in German, of course, about some of the German generals who fought the war, how they fought, the techniques, which would be very key to a research if you're making a film. And they just are not ready to release that. So as Saita Bao said, if you want to do something like that, you'd probably need to have official papers, permission to access it. You cannot take it out. So it means you would have to have permission to go to these special closed away spaces, probably take notes. You probably need to hire somebody who can do the translation for you. So this is your own history, and yet you're forced in many ways to jump hoops and even to spend extra money just to gain access to it. Another good example, and that we've not talked about, but it's an important also form of artifact, is audiovisual. And I think Saita Bao can talk about that. Today, if you want to do something about any of our country's independence era documentary, you'll probably find most of the archives are the property of BBC or one of these major, government-owned institutions in the West. And if you say you want to even get, let's say, 10 seconds of that, you'll pay an arm and a leg for it. So it is our own history. They recorded us, and now they own it, and they're monetizing it, and we have to pay for it. I find that very, very outrageous, and I find that in many ways, a country that has less of the colonial history because they were able to resist colonialism, and they only had a very brief partial colonialism like Ethiopia, have got a much better way of documenting that. And I'm always amazed by how, local households in Ethiopia can trace back their lineage for, 2-3 generations, and churches still have the records of them. So I think that colonialism did wreak a lot of havoc, but I'm wondering, how do we take back the narrative? How do we take back control of our own history and not be embarrassed every time when we just want to do a film or a documentary about our own history, that we're embarrassed that we have to go and really beg and jump hoops just to be able to do that? Sorry, I had to vent a little bit because I feel so strongly about that.
Thank you, Maria. I don't know if Ondeng has anything to say about that.
Yeah, Maria has raised a very important point. I think when you talk about restitution, it's not just about the cultural heritage, broadly speaking, but when you look at all the segments involved, archival, sound, film, they are a very important part of this continent. And they are unfortunately domiciled on the other side, given the fact that technology was set up by them. But they're an important part of our lives. You get to understand yourself better when you can have audiovisual of the environment through which the objects were created. And it's unfortunate that when you need them, you have to sign all these kind of documents before you can do that. But that's where I'm very particular with governments coming in. When you look at how the struggle for independence evolved in this country, it's about countries that had received their independence supporting others that were in the struggle. Now, virtually all African countries are independent, in quotes, because we still depend on benevolence of the Western government and looking east as to bring in goodies. But what they need to do with the independence in Africa is for us to have one voice. Let us demand for these things to come back. Make it a multilateral negotiation with the Western world and any other country that are holding these objects. Make it a bilateral negotiation whether you are negotiating for new roads. Also include these kind of things. When you want to do things with the trade with the West, also remind them that there are objects, things they are keeping, which they are not supposed to keep. And so if we can have all the resources, archival copies of the archival materials, we'll also be able even to understand the atrocities that were committed in a much better way. I know, as Maria has said, that there is the fear that people will be demanding for compensation. But that's what happened. The European world, after the Second World War, there are a lot of reparations around the Nazi atrocities. And what was committed in Africa, there were also atrocities. And who took responsibility for them? Independence was not just enough. It was not just about giving back the land, but it's also good to follow it up and say, okay, we are sorry. We killed people, in the process took away things. We are returning them, but it's also fair for us to compensate for the losses that occurred. You can't compensate really for human life, but it's also good a way of a token that will show that you are remorseful for the unfortunate events that happened in the past.
Just to make a more important point, keeping with the example of Maji-Maji, is that actually there were more victims, people who died during Maji-Maji than during the Herero uprising. And nobody talks about it because this fact is actually being held by the Germans. So we have to rely on them. And I still think that they actually are not even giving the real figures. I think it's in hundreds of thousands. So it's a lot of people were killed. They killed villages. They razed down, basically they did what they called scorched earth method. It's a very cruel method where they would burn down houses and crops and people starved to death. And it was really terrible. But what is very strange is that part of the history is not talked about. And I completely want to agree with you that if you look at it, and it is, I think in many ways, it was a prelude to what gave rise to the German Nazi regime. There was also a lot of racism involved, a lot of experimentations that went on in Africa, and some of that is not documented. So I think that history, the biggest problem we have by not owning our own artifacts, whether it's audiovisuals or actual physical objects, is that we don't have facts. That's why they're called artifacts. It's facts. So if we don't have facts, we don't own our history, and we're not able to track the cost of colonialism. So sometimes when we talk about it, it looks like we are whining. Sorry to use that word, but we look like whiners and we don't look like we can substantiate. I think that this conversation, just so that's why I'm throwing in all these other interesting aspects, should also include a little bit more of citizens trying to push governments. And that's where I completely agree actually with Ondeng, to say that I actually want to know, I'm from this tribe or I'm from this, area of my country, and I want to really learn what happened to our ancestors, because I don't have enough information, because my grandfather was hung by the Germans and I don't know what happened to my grandfather or how did it happen. And what I have is just, part information and part myth. So maybe we can also, in some ways, and that would be looking for the way forward, how can we pressure governments from our end to pressure now these Western governments to give us access to our history?
Right. That's a really good point there, Maria. I just want to open up the conversation, of course, to all our listeners who are with us today. If you would like to, just contribute to the conversation today, it's so important to note this. And one of the things I'm really getting from all of you, from Saita Bao to Charles and Ondeng and yourself, Maria, of course, is the importance of these artifacts, the fact that we need to come together in one united voice and, demand for the repatriation of these artifacts. And of course, just talking about the significance these artifacts and African museums have to just the continent, the communities, its issues of identity, it's just the attachment to heritage and so many other things. So I just want to open up the conversation to everyone else who's with us tonight, and let's just hear from you what you feel, perhaps even thoughts and ideas. What can we do as a continent towards ensuring all the artifacts that are being held until this moment are, returned to their respective countries? And then let's just look a little bit at the story of Patrice Lumumba. It's quite an interesting story. Belgium returning a golden tooth. This is really someone's body part, and that is the body part of the slain first Prime Minister of DR Congo. Some people online, it's been a big conversation, by the way, and people are saying this is typical of colonialists, keeping the tooth as a trophy, and it taking years for it to be released for burial, for closure. I mean, this even just tells you what has the family of the late Patrice been feeling? What do they feel at this moment? What really do you feel about this, Ondeng? Withholding of someone's body part, really?
We are talking of people who have no conscience of their actions. And Patrice Lumumba's tooth is just one of the many thousands of bodies and body parts that they are keeping. And just as you have said, those who are saying they're keeping them as trophies, that's what it is. Because why would you keep body parts? If, for example, any African country was keeping body parts of any European for whatever reason, I'm telling you, their governments will have been forcefully demanding for the return of such bodies for burial. And it is not any different from what is happening in the global north now. They keep body parts. So many. We have been tracing for the skull of Koitalel Arap Samoei. And because they don't write their names anywhere, where those human remains are, they're just classified as human remains. So keeping Patrice Lumumba's tooth or part of his body was just that, keeping it as a trophy of war. And that's what it is. So we need to have this. Maria did say that it's us, the people from Africa, who need to demand our government to take action. You know, politicians work better when they are under pressure. If this becomes a national movement, if it becomes an international movement within African continent, where communities, individuals, civil society, intellectuals, religious society are demanding action from government, things will change. We'll see policies put in place to handle, including what do you do with human remains when they come back. But as long as it is a conversation among the elite and it's not a mass movement, sadly, nothing will change. But it is sad for countries that lecture us continuously on human rights, transparency, accountability, and everything that they criticize in Africa, that when it comes to their turn, they do such things with impunity. And because of the power relations, no one holds them accountable. Because I don't know if what measures Democratic Republic of Congo can use now, even to demand for justice for the family of Patrice Lumumba, who have gone through almost 60-something years without remains of their loved one.
That's a very, very good comment there, Ondeng. What can DRC do even at this moment to demand justice? Interesting thoughts there. I mean, what can DRC do really? Will justice even be possible at this moment, given the number of years that the artifact has been held from, the family? I see Mohammed there. One of our listeners would like to contribute to the conversation. Mohammed, you can go ahead. Mohammed, if you can hear me, we're not able to hear you. If you can.
Okay, do you hear me now?
Yes, we hear you.
Okay, thank you, Lee. And allow me also to thank my mentor, my former mentor, Saita Bao, back in the DAP. And allow me also to say hi to my fellow Africans. And I'm Muhammad. I'm from Somalia, but educated in the DAP. And the DAP is located in northern part of Kenya. So I'm a junior filmmaker. And this history is a lot, and I've learned and gained a lot from you guys. And I would suggest, for us to educate our people on the importance and everything, I would suggest, let us have, such scenarios, maybe once in a month, because we have a lot of people who are below the age of 30 and who didn't know, a lot from Africa. So all those things that we learned from the school is something that was written by Muzungus. So I could suggest, we educate our people by having such scenarios. To me, I learn a lot because I never knew all those things, although I had some few, like Tanganyika history, and I learned it in History Form 3. So I could suggest, let our brothers, our well-educated Africans, speak, tell our young generation about our history, and that will make, Africans to be united. And back to you.
Thank you, Mohammed. Thank you for your contribution tonight. Great thoughts there. I just want to connect something that Mohammed has said, and this question will come to you, Saita Bao. Do you think there's a possibility that, some African countries have lost tracking on their history, given some of the artifacts that would inform that history are missing?
Sorry, could you say that again?
would you say perhaps some African countries, in terms of just mapping, because some of these artifacts, like we've talked about, they help inform some of the historical happenings, experiences that can be documented. But if you don't have these artifacts, sometimes, rather, this means that perhaps parts of, history of some countries may be missing, and this potentially just making some communities lose identity or a tracking on their identity. Would you say this is the case?
This is a case at the moment, but however, there's still hope to that, because not only is it just about the artifacts and the objects, it's also about that knowledge, that history, because if you also find something interesting that during one of my visits in the museums that I found out is also the archival, the audiovisual archival, where there are photographs, there was audios, and there was film reels that were taken. And you find some of these materials that were being taken by the then colonial government. Of course, there's the issue about intellectual property, because there's also about the people who they were photographing or filming, they never consented to that. That in itself is also very problematic, and yet you hold this information and this material, this archival material. It's one of the things that we also have to question. So there's still hope. All is not lost, and that's why even for us as Africans, remember during the Nazi era, there was this task group of monument men. Yeah, the monument men were the people who are trying to save the art that were looted by the Nazis. So for us as Africans, it's time sort of to be able to be the monument men or the monument people of our time, and it will require a task force, not just a task force, but you require everyone involved, be it also like lawyers when it comes to challenging the intellectual property of the people who are photographed without the consent. It will involve artists, it will involve filmmakers, it will involve anthropologists, intellectuals, government officials. So all is not lost, but if nothing is done as of now, it will slowly fade away. And that's why hence we always find ourselves where we have identity crisis. Yeah, we do not know who we are. Sometimes we're a bit too Western. We're always having identity issues and discovering who we are. So it's very important to regain back and sort of gain the power. And it's always about power dynamics. But if we're able to gain that knowledge, and for instance, whatever was also documented by the colonial governments back then, it is not 100% accurate, because also remember, they were doing the kind of documentation with a bias. They had this mentality where they're like, look at these Africans. So they never really got so deep to understand how Africans were operating, or how they use the artifacts or the knowledge system. So it's also important for us to retrace and regain that knowledge and sort of reconstruct before all is lost.
Thank you, Saitabao. Charles, what do you feel about, where we are right now as a continent? I know Saitabao says we need to move hastily and just make sure that we preserve these artifacts and the museums. But maybe you can just give us an idea of how important it has been for communities that are within the area where the Ma Museum, of which you are a founder, has been to them, in preserving their history, preserving some of the artifacts that give them a sense of identity. What use do you think this museum, or you feel this museum, has been to the communities surrounding the Ma Museum?
The Ma Museum and the Center for Indigenous Cultures aims to work with the communities to safeguard, of course, their heritage culture. And within also that, the Ma Museum was able to to get the award of the United Nations World Tourism Organization as the best tourism village. And what does that mean? It means working with the communities for them to identify their heritage, for them to preserve their cultures, and also involve them as communities to be able to safeguard and protect their lands. Currently, for example, in Kenya, we have some of the group ranches, community lands, and with the introduction of the Community Land Act of 2016, you actually get it misinterpreted, so that communities, it also brings conflicts in the communities. For those who say yes, let us agree to subdivide our land and everybody to have his shares. Another says, let us leave it as a community land. When again, of course, our governments, and especially the county government, does not understand the act very well, then they might misinterpret the information, and the communities are also pushed to subdivide their lands because there are also those who are behind and are interested to get lands. And when we sell this land, then we may not be able again to really safeguard the heritage, the sites, sites of value, those ones that with extraordinary value that they're able. The Mar Museum has been, others say, a godsend, because we were able to carry out, and this was when I was working, we were able to carry out research just to find out what are some of the sites of value that needs to be protected by these communities. And we are also now helping communities to be able to establish their own community-led conservancies. And when they have their own conservancies, then the heritage, the culture, the sites are protected. And when you have investors coming in to put our hotel, then the communities can be able to get jobs. And that will, of course, reduce that movement to big towns. So the Maasai Museum has really been able to work with the communities, but they need their governments to work with them, to support them, to help them set these conservancies and sanctuaries. I have a number of sites that I have been pushing, and it has been raised in TV, in papers, features, and all that. We have sites like the breeding site of flamingos, in Lake Natron. And again, it's a big worry to us when again we have our own governments, like the government of Tanzania, evicting the Maasais from Ngorongoro. And we agree on issues of population alternatives other than they evict people, beat the Maasais, move them from their ancestral land. They lose all the heritage sites. It's just another form of colonialism that needs to be relooked at. We have what we call biocultural laws and treaties. I think we need to get back as governments and push our governments so that we have that regional cooperation, East African community. Otherwise, when the same communities are safeguard these lands and heritage, and they lose a lot of their artifacts when they are being moved illegally from this area. I am not saying we should not protect the heritage; they should be protected. And IUCN came up with a very strong statements. We have had petitions for the same, and even petitions for Ledume, who was taken away. I mean, it is time the museums are supported. We are supported to really facilitate those discussions so that we can safeguard our heritage very well, and even the artifacts that are there. The many that I had to get. Of course, you have to use a lot of resources, and sometimes you may not even have funds, even for your own children, because you have invested a lot in this. Because I believe in Africans safeguarding their heritage and culture for the future generations, and keep the little artifacts that are there in a nice way. Get them in storage get them in museums. Thank you.
Thank you, Charles. By the way, Ondeng, I tend to wonder because I know also Kenya has been affected, and I think I mentioned it earlier on, but I'm just interested to know how much of Kenya's artifacts are stashed in museums abroad, if any?
Oh God, what a question. For now, I'll tell you that the number is not known. When you look at the International Inventories Program, which was a partnership program involving National Museums of Kenya, the Nest Collective, the Shift Collective, and 2 museums in Germany, Rautenstrauss Jost Museum in Cologne and Walter Kulten Museum in Frankfurt. The database, as at now, we are at 32,000 plus, slightly over 32,000 objects. Now, it's good also for me to say here that those 32,000 objects are not, all of them are not criminally acquired. And they are from about, we wrote letters as part of IIP to 100 museums worldwide. But so far, we have gotten response for about 32 museums from 7 countries. What does that say? We still have so many museums because Europe itself has thousands of museums. Because if you go to any country, they'll tell you they have, German has about 5,000 or so museums. Great Britain will have about 5,000 or so museums. So we have several of these museums, and some of the collections are in hands of families and other private collectors. So if we just assume the number of objects that are out there, that will give us a very erroneous figure. And that's why I said, for us to establish these figures, there's need for broad engagement in creating a comprehensive database. We need to still continue engaging with institutions in the global north. And some of these are also in Asia, because when you look at museums in Japan and in China and in Korea, they have been collecting, and a museum in Middle East, and even some museums within the continent. I'm sure there are collections from Kenya that will be found in South African museums and other parts of the continent. So for us to know what objects are or cultural heritage material are outside this country, it will take us ages for us to do that. And it needs a more broad team to engage in that process of creating that database so that we talk from an informed point of view. So far, the database of 32,000, that is a scratch in the surface. Thank you.
Wow. And that just brings me to this question. And again, I'll just point it out to you, Ondeng. Some people say, and we've seen reports and stories and articles written about this, that Europeans clinging onto the artifacts because they have commodified them, antiques which are enriching the lucrative museum business in Europe. Might you have maybe just a rough idea of just, how much do they make from these museums and the artifacts that were looted from Africa? I'm sure it runs into millions or billions, I wouldn't know, but just give us maybe a rough idea or a picture on, just the kind of enrichment that European countries are enjoying from artifacts that have been looted from the continent.
Now, objects have different values. I think that there are museums, I'll give an example of German museums, where these museums belong to state governments. And those state governments demand that museum must give or attach value, monetary value to each object. So an inventory of a museum is part of wealth of a state. And therefore, that museum gets funded based on the number of objects in its collection. Now, what that means that each museum with African collection, which is part of wider collection they have, will then get funded based on that. And it's hard for us to estimate what that value is. But there are other engagement through which these museums make money. For example, if they engage in international loans, those international loans are paid for, and such are ways through which they make extra money just by loaning these objects. So when you look at the Benin bronzes, for example, before they became hot issue in terms of the demands for them to go back, there were kind of those objects that museums will trade in, giving out to other museums to carry out temporary loans. And in exchange, they will get money through sponsors, because, exhibitions in Europe are mostly, in most cases, they're either corporate sponsored or they are specially funded by projects. And in such, if a corporate sponsor was going to bring in a rare object from Europe, they have to pay both the insurance and also the museum holding that object, then get money for the duration that object will be hosted in a different museum. So it's hard to estimate how much money they do, because remember, some of these things are never in the mass media. So it's hard for you to speculate from the point of just knowing one object have moved from one museum to another. So I won't lie, because it will be erroneous for me as a museum professional to put figures when I don't have facts. Thank you.
All right, thank you. And then as we just come to a close of this conversation, I know I'm seeing here one of our listeners by the name Priska. I'll just give you a chance, Priska, to make your contribution to the conversation as we come to a close of today's discussion.
Thank you very much. I want to tell you, to talk about the museums and the artifacts. Some of our heritage, we are not aware of how important they are to us. Like Olduvai George, I met a Ghanaian man who was telling me that they have a group of people who go to Olduvai George for pilgrim in annual basis. So what I was thinking, how many Tanzanians or East Africans know the importance of that Olduvai George? Some of us, we are very... I'm thinking the education should be go out there to local people to know the importance of our heritages, so that we'll be able to protect them. Like we don't know. Some people in Tanzania had never been to Olduvai George and they don't know where it is. So kind of this awareness for people who have interest should be out there. And I think local ways of doing that is promoting local libraries, which can have such kind of information for people who wants to know. That's what I wanted to contribute in.
Thank you, Priska. I know I had one of our listeners also from South Africa there who wanted to say something. Let me see your name here. Njechele, I hope I'm pronouncing your name right, but maybe you can go ahead. Actually, not from South Africa, sorry, that's from Tanzania. Njechele, you can go ahead. Njechele, if you can hear me. Unfortunately, we are not able to hear you, Njechele. Maybe you can tap on the microphone icon on your bottom left of your screen, if you're able to, if you can hear me. Unfortunately, we can't really seem to connect with you properly. And Njechele, I'm really, really sorry about that, but we're happy that you are part of the conversation today, nevertheless. As we come to a close, Ondeng, Saitabao, Charles, I mean, we need to just hear just your final remarks about this particular topic. Again, I'm seeing one of our listeners. I do really want to give you a chance. Let me just give this one listener by the name, if I can just see your name properly before we come to a close. I really love giving, just an opportunity for everyone to speak. That's Ombudsman Life. Your account goes by that name. You can go ahead and make your contribution.
Hello.
We can hear you.
Hello. Can you hear me, please?
Yes, we can hear you. Go ahead.
Hello. Thank you so much. Hello.
We can hear you. Go ahead. We're having, I think, a connection issue there. Ombudsman, if you can hear me, maybe you can unmute your microphone. Sadly, we're not able to connect. Okay, we need to come to a conclusion of tonight's discussion. I'll just give you, Sietebao, Ondeng, and Charles an opportunity to just make your final remarks about today's conversation that has been so helpful, quite insightful, especially. Sietebao, let me just give you the floor.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for the opportunity and the platform just to share and talk. It's very important also to have dialogue, especially among the African continent, about this very issue. And I'm hoping each and every listener at this space will be able sort of to create more awareness and more importance of the value. And in regards to, do we value them enough? It's a double-folded question, but we should value them as much as would want to, but also let's not forget their communities who really value some of these artifacts and require these artifacts to go back to the community. So whoever is here, just feel free to spread the word, and let's continue having this important conversation. For the people in Tanzania, our film will be If Objects Could Speak, will be part of the Marejesho Research Exhibition, which will be screening around Kilimanjaro and the Meru region around August, September. So we'll definitely share more information also on this platform. Just be on the outlook, and let's continue having this conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Sietebao. Charles, you can go ahead.
My last remarks is to see a commitment by, of course, the looters and also the colonizers to come with terms with the colonial history, but also let us also have a new collaboration to return the African objects stolen forcibly, and also for our governments to support the community and individuals and private museums so that they can be able to keep this and safeguard for the future generation. So any support is welcome to support these museums that are surviving on their own. And we ask for our next government after the election to really look back at museums and help us safeguard the heritage and the treasures of this country and the communities.
By the way, Charles, before I leave you, I know you mentioned the issue of the Maasai community that has been, forcibly evicted from their ancestral land back in Tanzania. Might you have maybe some information on what is happening? I know this really goes deep for the Maasai community. It's not just about the ancestral land. It's about the heritage. It's about, identity. What's the experience like on the ground? If you may even have some, interaction with some of the community members who have been affected.
The area that's affected is not very far from Olerge Zaile and parts of southern Kenya, where the museum, one of the museums, is located, and the situation is not very, very good. We have already communities that have been affected. Some have accepted voluntarily and have been taken like 600 kilometers. Well, they may be okay because they have arrived well, but we have the children, the mothers, the women who have crossed in Kenya and the parts of Narok. And these people need food, they need clothing. And we also need to engage the governments to engage Tanzanian government, because I believe the current president of Tanzania is a mother. She should listen to their cry and seek for alternatives to address the issue on the ground, but not really to to see what is happening in Tanzania against the Maasais who are evicted from Serengeti to Ngorongoro and now Ngorongoro to just because of wildlife hunting. That's actually the reason, so that the big king's family from Arab Emirates can be able to kill these lions and kill animals because of business. Anyway, it's not the best way to look at this community. It's very sad, and these are communities that have safeguarded heritage, and that's why we were awarded for the best tourism village by the United Nations. So we look forward to engage our governments and to listen to the cry of the people and to do it in a human way, other than inflict a lot of pain to these communities. Thank you.
Thank you, Charles. Ondeng, your final remarks, please.
I would like to urge all of us, this is a journey that we are all in, and politicians listen to their people. If this conversation can go all the way to the ward level, the constituency level, it will find itself in our parliaments. And parliaments will be able to allocate funds for us to do provenance research, to create these databases, and to start the conversation of bringing serious engagement of bringing the objects back home. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ondeng. So happy to have had all of you, our speakers and listeners also, and all those who have taken part in this discussion and have been contributors. Maria, before we come to a close, do you have any comments? I can give you a chance.
Yeah, I just wanted to say this was a great conversation, and I just had so much fun having all these different inputs. I also wanted to point out that it's very important that we take what Ondeng said around the fact that this is not just collective memory, but in fact what we're seeing is that this is collective memory, but it is also about the future. I think that's one of the most powerful statements we can take away. And whether we are just talking, well, just when I say just, actually it's not just, it's very important, but whether we are talking about the Ma Museum, which we look at as just one community, whether we are talking about a national museum, whether we are talking about a regional museum, which by the way, we don't have, but whatever we look at from whichever perspective, I think it's very important for us to acknowledge that these are important parts of who we are and who we want to be. And because of that, we should make sure we safeguard them and we make sure that it becomes part of even the more larger political context and conversation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Maria. And thank you to all our speakers, Saita Bao Kayare, a filmmaker who has also produced a documentary on artifacts dubbed If Objects Could Speak. Of course, also Charles Leshore, the founder of Ma Museum, and of course, also not forgetting Juma Ondeng, the keeper of antiquities sites and monuments at the National Museums of Kenya. Thank you so much for making time, and for everyone who has been part of this discussion and contributed. We hope to have you again next week, same time, same day, that's 7 p.m. on Wednesday, where we talk about all issues that are affecting the African continent. Remember again to just visit our social media platforms. You will find much more content, whether it's security, politics, social issues, health, business. It is all there. That's Mwanzo TV on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, and of course also YouTube. Thank you again for joining us. My name is Liangare. Until next time, same place. God bless.